My name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. Before we get started, I have a few logistical items to cover. As we know, our world has shifted significantly in the last 45 days, and we know security is top of mind with the changes in our workforce. If you have questions for the panel, please submit them through the Q&A chat window, and we'll answer them along the way. We are recording this session, and we'll be sharing the link with those that are unable to make it today, and if you also want to pass it along to your colleagues who might be interested in the discussion. Before I turn it over to today's speakers, I wanted to provide a quick introduction to the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. The IDSA is a nonprofit organization that facilitates community collaboration to help organizations reduce risk by providing education, best practices, and resources to implement identity-centric security. Our membership is comprised of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board members, who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. We deliver on our mission through cross-vendor collaboration, thought leadership through blogs, white papers, and webinars such as this one, Identity-Centric Security Framework, which is a vendor-agnostic set of best practices, security outcomes, and approaches, sharing customer implementation stories similar to what you'll hear about today, and providing a virtual community for sharing experiences and validation across the practitioner community. In the coming weeks, we'll be publishing the results of our latest survey, highlighting the latest trends in identity-related security, as well as our latest iteration of the Identity-Defined Security Framework. So make sure to be on the lookout for that new content. Now on to our panel discussion. Stop sharing. Remember to enter your questions for the panel in the Q&A window along the way. Now I'm going to turn it over to Julie Talbot-Hubbard, the General Manager and Global Vice President of Identity and Data Management Solutions with Optiv, who will be moderating our panel today. Julie, over to you for introductions and our discussion.
Great, thank you, Julie, and welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and just turn it over to the panelists to have them give an introduction of themselves. And James, we'll start with you.
That sounds good. Thanks, Julie. James Carter, Chief Security Officer at LogRhythm, also the VP of R&D at LogRhythm. Been in information security for a while, big zero trust guy for the past probably close to 10 years. So happy to participate today.
Dan?
Hi folks, I'm Dan Jones, Director of Enterprise Security for Adobe. Our mission is to improve the security posture for our users and our data.
Great, thank you, Dan. Morey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. My name is Morey Haber. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Information Security Officer for BeyondTrust. Been with the organization about 17 years now and looking forward to participating on this panel today.
Great, thank you.
So I would think 3 for 75 minutes.
Yeah, and I'm Clint Maples. Yeah, last but not least, most recently CISO of SigFig. And we're just sort of embarking on our zero trust journey right now.
Great. Yeah, last saw you guys in person, we were at RSA. So we did somewhat a similar discussion there. It'll be great to reconnect with you guys via Zoom today. So really wanted to talk a little bit about, Julie mentioned we've got a new survey being released in the coming weeks that IDSA put out there. But in the fall, we conducted a survey of 511 security leaders, really to get their perspective on how identity is managed across their organization. I know from my experience, I've worked across many different sectors, financial, software, healthcare. And so I've seen identity managed, deployed, different resource models as well. But really wanted to get your guys' input here on the webinar today on, really how is identity managed within your organization. Touch on maybe ownership of the strategy, budget, resources, priorities, and also if you've seen a shift or a change over the last, I would say 6 months or a year as well. So maybe, I don't know, Dan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so our organization, we focus on the internal identities for our employees. It's been an interesting journey because we've spent 20 years plus. I think I started doing identity in 1994, and since then it really didn't evolve much. It was let's say we can identify who you are. You get to log in. Multi-factor authentication became a thing, and people were busy trying to adopt that stuff. But ultimately, things like still changing your passwords, still using a password, those are still prevalent in the industry. And then the notion of changing your password every 90 days, that's still prevalent in the industry. So as we were embarking on a set of improvements, and I'll loosely use the term zero trust. I mean, I guess that's the bandwagon that we fall under. But when we think of it, we've basically said, look, the identity has to evolve. And it's not just the identity of the user, it's the identity of the device as well. And we went down a mission to eradicate using the password for the first factor. And we successfully pushed that out. And then we went through a mission to make sure we have security intelligence around authentication patterns so that we could look for anomalous behavior and bad actors, not just on the first factor, but on the second factor. And then we deployed that piece. And then as part of these efforts, we actually managed to work with our auditors to say we no longer need to change our passwords. We'll only change our passwords on compromise indicator, which we've got a lot of monitoring in place to pick that up. And as part of our authentication and our zero trust strategy, we're looking at the device posture more and more as we are allowing that device plus that user in context together to access applications. And it's been about a 1.5-year journey, which resulted in us deploying to over 40,000 devices, 30,000 users, and 2,000 applications. So it's been fast moving and very successful so far.
So before I turn it over to the other panelists, just question more on, I guess, from a budget standpoint, alignment in the organization. So how did you really obtain the budget? I guess, is that within the security organization? Are there other factors that contribute to that, Den?
Yeah, so our organization, so we don't sit within IT, we partner with IT, and in the security organization, we actually run all the identity platform, the Active Directories, the Oktas, and all of those things. And we'd identified cost savings that we would then reinvest in to make this program possible. So we basically spent $240,000 in year one to deploy our Zero Trust platform. We increased our staff by 1, and I repurposed 4 people in the organization. So the reality is, I've heard a lot of people say this is a really hard thing to do. And if you're in control of the application authentication piece, and people want to log into email and want to log into their wikis and everything else, then you're actually in control of that auth workflow. And it's really a case of we just modified the auth workflow to then bring in the posture check. So it wasn't really expensive. And, if you have a great partner in your identity platform, so we're an Okta shop, but, if you've got any of the others and you're all on SAML or something like that, then it is possible to inject another piece into that workflow without too much trouble. So that's all we've done.
Great, thank you, Den. And James, I guess more from identity, you're a security organization by nature, LogRhythm. So just really interested on, and I know you wear dual hats, but where's your identity organization placed today from an organizational standpoint on strategy, budget, resources, and priorities? And really, have you seen any shifts in the last year or so?
I've actually seen shifts starting probably about 10 years ago. In my previous org, I worked in healthcare, and people started realizing that, security should be driven around identities, and not just someone as a user as an identity, but their devices, their behaviors, everything as separate identities. And so in that part of the org, identity management was owned by the security function. And then that carried over into my current role at LogRhythm, which I've been at for 5 years, where the security organization owns the budget, owns the strategy for identity, and we partner with IT. Obviously, they have to go do a lot of implementation work and partner with us on that. But we own the governance, the budget, and strategy all around identity.
Terrific. And then Clint?
So in our organization, there's a bit of a division. So corporate IT actually rolls up under security. So anything that's corporate IT related has sort of we've centered on one identity, so we have Okta for that, and all of our kind of cloud solutions, and anything that is sort of back office is authenticated through that, and the budget and everything rolls into corporate IT for that. And then for everything that's production related, that is managed by our infrastructure team, and actually have a different identity set there. They're kind of own, they're using LDAP in that environment. And so that was kind of one of our first challenges, is kind of making those two systems play nicely together, and how do we start doing automated provisioning and deprovisioning across those.
So Clint, more, I guess, from an organization, because when we first introduced, I know you said you were just looking at Zero Trust, interested, I guess, on your perspective on Zero Trust, and, are you going down that path? Have you made that decision to really achieve and operate in that kind of with that mindset? And I look at it as the whole security strategy shift that organizations are taking right now. And if so, what were some of the drivers and expected security outcomes of that?
We're somewhat fortunate in that when we started the process of kind of building the organization, or before I got there, they had this kind of cloud-first approach on everything that was corporate security related, and they wanted to treat the office or any of our offices just like sort of Wi-Fi at a Starbucks or something like that, right? So they didn't want you being in a particular location to grant you any additional security privileges. So from the beginning, they were sort of on that kind of path, even though the tools weren't really in place, right? So that relied heavily on VPN. Everybody would dial up on VPN from the corporate office over the Wi-Fi and get into the different things that they needed. And then it's sort of from, I think, convenience and operability, it's getting pushed that way as, users were sick of having to manage lots of different passwords and accounts. So we went to single sign-on, right? And that was a productivity win for IT and for security and the employees as well. And then we would see lots of things like phishing campaigns and other things where people were trying to do employee account takeovers, because I get an email and I click on it and it looks just like, some web page I'm supposed to log into, and I type my username and password in there, and now my account's compromised. So, the response to that was, let's do MFA. So we were kind of close to that path already. And then we said, okay, well, how can we get more trust around the endpoints and even manage our endpoints more efficiently? We had sort of a diverse or dispersed workforce. Probably about 40% of our employees are not in our main office, and we employ a lot of remote employees. So you would just get IT calls like, I'm having a problem with my laptop, and how do I fix that remotely, right? So getting the tools in place to be able to do remote management of our endpoints and push out patches and really kind of control the posture of that endpoint was a driver there as well. And it turned out, as we were putting things in place, this is what we also needed to go to Zero Trust. So, we want to be able to ship a laptop directly from, if we buy a Mac or a PC from the manufacturer, we want to be able to mail it directly to our remote employee, have them turn it on, and it provision itself, right? So, the Zero Touch provisioning through Jamf and Microsoft Autopilot was a win for IT, but it ends up being a win for Zero Trust as well, right? Because now we have end user device or endpoint management with Jamf and Intune, where now we can push patches, push certificates, and start doing device health checks when employees log in. So it's kind of just been naturally moving that way, I think, from what the users want, what IT wants, and what security wants.
That's great. And it's similarities between even, Den talked more about, getting budget, getting support from some efficiencies, and then just efficiencies he brought with his own organization. And it sounds like you've also used that user experience as really a driver on that as well. So Morey, I'm just curious, given you're at BeyondTrust, another security organization, really interested more on, what, for your Zero Trust approach, how did you pivot? What were some of those drivers, and where are you at today?
Yes, thank you, Julie. So it's interesting because I wear two hats. As a security vendor, I help drive the strategy of the organization, but as the CISO, I have similar challenges to my peers as we're covering in this panel. Over 2 years ago, BeyondTrust was actually acquired by Bomgar. We're a combination of 4 companies. Baumgart, Lieberman, Vecto, and BeyondTrust, but with BeyondTrust name today. What really is interesting about that is all 4 companies had different security policies, different implementations, different identity management tools, and we had to go through that reconciliation, and that's where I stepped in. We did it in about 6 months, and we took a lot of similar models to what Clint and Dan did, that we said, look, we're not going to try to move everybody to one idea or one concept and one tool set versus another. Let's find the best technology that's out there and migrate everybody. And that was successful. We went to things like Okta. We moved 90% of our resources to the cloud and manage our identities from the cloud versus trying to retrofit a lot of different systems. So we converted a lot of our back office, our identity management and security to that direction so that as the company grows worldwide, we can continue to support it in region, not be so dependent on legacy on-premise systems, and really try to embrace the next generation identity approach with zero trust and also least privilege. No one has admin rights in our organization to make sure that we stay as secure as possible.
Oh, that's great. I know many organizations have struggled with that least privilege model for years. I think some are still trying to solve for it. So we've got a couple good questions from the audience, you guys out there. So I'm going to just throw it out there to the group. So first, I know that Clint, you were talking a little bit about device management. Question we have out there is from Dilip. I have heard talk about control over devices with device management services. What are organizations doing when the endpoints cannot be managed?
Yeah, when they can't be managed, that's certainly a challenge. I think we don't have any endpoints left that can't be managed, but getting to that point where we could, that was sort of our first task down this journey, was we needed to be able to manage every endpoint. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably where you have to start. And it was a challenge. We had some devices out there that didn't have the software on them that we needed to manage it. So that was our first focus. And some of that was, you know, a little kludgy. You're emailing an installer to them or using whatever tools that you have in place. You know, sometimes we would do it with Zoom, where we'd actually set up a screen share with them to get that solution or that software out there. For our Macs, we're using Jamf, and for our PCs, we're using Intune. We're a little bit fortunate in that we're a much smaller company. So, you know, with 250 employees, the few devices that were kind of not managed, it wasn't a huge lift to go out and get them. But if you're, you know, a much larger organization, I think it's certainly going to be a challenge. You might have to do some wizardry with logon scripting or some other kinds of tools you have in place to deploy that. I'd be curious to hear how the other larger organizations maybe had to deal with that.
One thing I'll just add on, and I'd be interested in any other panelists, but I think also in the last 45 days, you know, the shifts that many organizations are now working at home, I would think there's many organizations that are either having to allow or looking at, you know, allowing individuals to use their own devices that I would think cannot be managed to access corporate information in networks.
Yeah, Julie, that's an interesting question and an interesting problem, because when we specify the devices unmanaged, we generally assume BYOD, which is really important in this current age. You can have several things that you can do. You can take a bad security practice, like allowing the end user to put VPN on their home computers, which is the wrong thing to do. But some people have had to do it. Some organizations have had no choice in order to do productivity or keep productivity. The best approaches are some form of bastion host that their home computer can connect into so that they don't have any corporate software on their home machine, or using dedicated remote access tools so that the connection is actually not protocol tunneling based. It's some type of proxy or jump point or jump client into the organization, and you keep the unmanaged personal device completely separate and not able to infect or anything else to the corporate infrastructure or even cloud resources at that point for regular access and privileged access.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. So technically, any device can be managed. There's never a computer on the planet that can't be unmanaged that you would want to have connected to your environment. This is really a policy question, and I think the policy depends on the risk of the business. And since we'd like to say we're security experts, but I've heard somebody once say we're not security experts, we're all risk mitigation experts. So the mitigation in this case, as Morey says, we're on a journey to deploy DAS. So that if you are a vendor, a BYOD person, we actually don't want you to connect to anything. Just go to a virtual host in the cloud, and then we'll put controls in place via our policy that says you cannot exfil data from that client in the cloud to your local host. I think the reality is it's really easy technically to take an up-to-date workstation operating system and manage it. It's really hard to think of your business and your policy and really what you're trying to achieve there without crumbling the business, right?
Maybe to add on, I think everybody's kind of covered this topic quite well, but coming from the healthcare world, there is things like medical devices that are very tough to manage. But even if you look at that perspective, and even though you hear like, oh, we can't touch a medical device for whatever reason, those medical devices talk into back-end controllers that you can touch and that you can actually do some of the device management at that level. And so even on those types of systems or industrial control systems, you can still manage that device. The other part too, from a contractor or third-party access perspective, we all talked about it's a risk-based decision, but if the risk is great, ship them a device that you can manage and have them use that. I mean, that's something that we've done as well, in addition to the Bastion hosts and VDI type infrastructure and things like that.
Yeah, that's what we did. We outsourced some QA folks and we shipped them all laptops, which became way easier when you could zero touch provision, right? Because now we just order them, buy them, and expense it to them.
So James, just wanting to hear from you a little more about your zero trust approach. Really, how did you make that pivot, and what were some of the outcomes that you were looking to achieve?
Yeah, I think, someone alluded to it earlier, zero trust has some obviously significant security benefit. And when you can separate things and look at kind of like the traditional IT architecture and kind of flip it on its head and separate things into these small pockets, you can do a lot with that. So you can separately authenticate and authorize things. And I look at it, I joke around that I call it the Titanic Principle, where in theory and in strategy, the Titanic was built soundly, where if one compartment, or in this case, one identity was compromised, you could still prevent the compromise of the entire ship, or in our case, a breach of the entire organization. And so I think there were some significant security benefits, but there was also a ton of IT operations benefits as well, around efficiency gains associated with automated move, add, change, automated provisioning, deprovisioning, self-service stuff. There's a lot of capability there that actually helped drive costs down in the IT organization. And then when I tacked on like, hey, if we do this, we can get rid of the VPNs, we can get rid of the firewalls, and ultimately we can get rid of Active Directory if we wanted to. And so when you balance all that out, it pays for itself, and it provides you the security and IT benefits. So that appealed to the IT org, it appealed to the security org, and it appealed to our board, who's going to fund it.
No, that's great, James. And
I feel like we're part of like this, almost like an AA group here with all of us in Zero Trust. And I think Okta is getting a little press because I think most of us have Okta as our identity provider. But I think the one cool thing to add is that Zero Trust used to be this thing that, Google custom built all these apps and everything else to customize their Zero Trust approach. But there's commercially off-the-shelf products now that when you combine them together and they work together interchangeably, you can realize a Zero Trust model fairly quickly and efficiently based on that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because Zero Trust definition, and I think we've all spoken about this, is different for all of us, whether it's vendors or anybody else. And the one good thing is NIST has come out with a great paper that gives a good outline for it. And as James indicated, a variety of tools or products that are specifically designed for it can help anyone get a Zero Trust architecture implemented across the board. And there are some caveats. Peer-to-peer applications, some legacy applications won't necessarily behave well with this type of design. But for the most part, you can do quite well in securing your systems. Just use a definition that's well established as you move forward.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah,
sorry, Clint. Is the
no, go ahead, Dan.
We're all using the word Zero Trust, but I think there's everyone's got a different view of what we mean or what that implementation looks like. And I think for us, we are beginning from the client identity side out, coming in to apps and services. but then there are people that are doing, you know, server to server, peer to peer, and a lot of other blends or combinations. So that for me is a big thing. But since this is an identity conversation, then I instantly switch it to, hey, this is the identity view of the world as I'm a user coming in, because the biggest benefit or bang for the buck is all the users that get to experience an easier way of working that we've all been describing and be more secure.
Great.
Yeah, we started with our cloud stuff first, I mean, because that was easier. But it's been interesting to see the tools, some of the existing solutions we had in place are starting to release functionality to help this process. So like the VPN client we were originally using is now doing host health checking and all this other stuff where you can check to see if it has certificates in AV and these other types of things you want to do for host health. So that helped us in the areas where we weren't ready to transition yet to put some of those sort of policies in place. And then some of the tools that we brought in, like our MFA solution, also had some underlying functionality that had some really kind of cool security wins that we weren't counting on. So, I mean, unfortunately, not wanting to market for, you know, I'm sure this is supposed to be vendor agnostic. We happen to be using Duo, but one of the features that they had that we weren't aware of was you can push more than just a, is this you signing in message to your phone. So now we're actually looking at taking different alerts from our security systems, like, oh, we saw this user do something over here, and using the API and Duo to push that and say, hey, did you just execute this command, or did you just log into this system, and having them hit that like yes, no that they're familiar with, and if they don't, sort of escalating that to the security team. So it's, you know, if you're struggling with the budget challenge, there's oftentimes a lot of kind of additional things and functionality in there that you can kind of point to as sources of value.
So I had another question here from the audience. And I know James was talking more about Okta and about just different ways of achieving zero trust. This question specifically around identity directories. And it's an individual that's really wanting to understand, you know, thoughts on which identity directory to focus on, make it more AD-centric, email, LDAP, mix and match. You know, what are some of the approaches that you guys have taken, or I guess ones that you've taken and you wish you hadn't taken, or ones that you, what you've learned from? I know I've got my experiences with AD, but just curious on maybe I saw James, you smile first, so we'll turn it over to you.
I think we have universal love for AD on this. You know, I spent 6 years at Mandiant, so, you know, every single breach was compromising Active Directory, dumping credentials, and then going from there. And so I'm scarred a bit by leveraging AD. And so I think it does depend on your business model, though, you know, and what you do from, you know, how you operate your business will determine which identity store is best for you. I mean, if you look at the zero trust model where, you know, AD still requires an Active Directory setup, and then you can do SAML and other things, but you're still kind of coming back to this central piece that's traditionally on-prem in a lot of cases, unless you're, you know, using Office 365 or something like that. But I think cloud-based identity stores is the way to go, especially because that takes the location stuff out of it. It provides a ton of flexibility, and I think it helps you kind of proxy things through and route them accordingly. And so I'm a big fan of, you know, the cloud-centric identity stores like Okta, obviously, and I would choose that night and day. And in fact, I get a lot of like smirks whenever I say I'm going to get rid of Active Directory, but literally that is a mission I have, is to get rid of Active Directory on-prem and just be full identity in the cloud.
Yeah, and we're working on that as well. It is really funny. So I about 3 years ago, I told the team we're going to shut down AD on-prem. And all the Microsoft AD lovers were giving me so much grief about that. And the reality was, it was not my decision. It was not my strategy. It was Microsoft's strategy, because Microsoft have invested millions and millions of dollars to pivot towards Azure AD. Like, they're trying to drive the demise of on-premise AD. So that's their mission, is they want to be a cloud directory as well. So I think the big thing for us is, if you have the ability, then figure out a way to get Active Directory out of your environment people who went really heavy with GPOs and all those things, they don't realize that, you know, you can use an MDM solution to achieve the same goal. You don't necessarily need GPOs. You can have groups and you can have other things in the cloud directory. So the reality is the reason AD existed going back to the 90s, that reason no longer exists now. So if you are a greenfield site and you're deploying AD, then shame on you. If you're doing an Exchange upgrade, then shame on you, because you should be moving that to the cloud. And the reality is there might be business reasons for that, but those tend to be paranoid policy decisions rather than financial benefit or the more make your business more agile. And I think, as James says, you know, this is being cloud directory centric actually enables better mobility, better scalability, and actually more secure. Because the reality is Active Directory on premise, it was so easy to compromise your domain admins. It was so easy to compromise other privileged users that getting rid of it is actually probably the most secure thing you'll do from a directory perspective.
Yeah, fully agree. We're on the same path. Like you say, it's difficult depending on your tech stack. And I think, unfortunately, our effort to move to just one directory has led to more directories. Right now, we're on-prem AD, in the cloud AD, the Okta directory, and we have LDAP in production. And, you know, we're still trying to get that all consolidated, but that's definitely the dream, right? And I agree. If I were to start in a small shop and they were kind of, you know, didn't have anything in place, I would certainly be looking at cloud first. You know, if you have to be Microsoft, just do Azure AD. It's great. And if not, then find a good identity provider like Okta or one of the other providers out there, and never have to deal with, you know, one of those directory services. That'd be great.
Yeah, fully agree. Fully agree.
So I'm just going to kind of switch it up a bit, but we've all talked about zero trust, and many of you guys have already adopted it, moving down that path. With the shift we recently seen the last 45 days due to COVID, you know, many organizations have had to shift to remote working. You know, just curious on, because many of you have already taken that zero trust approach, how prepared were you guys? Did you feel that the zero trust approaches provided you more preparedness than if you hadn't gone down that path?
I'll take it. You know, I think this relates to an earlier question too about funding and kind of your strategy around zero trust. That if you've got an IT organization that you partner with that has a cloud first strategy, well, this is perfect. You just buckle onto the cloud first strategy that they already have, and you move as one into this zero trust model. And I think when you do that, and so like we've done that where 95% of our operation is all in the cloud and all SaaS. So, you know, and since we're going down the zero trust path where, you know, location is not a significant indicator of trust, or the only indicator of trust in some cases, we were custom built for this. And so we didn't lose any security visibility. We didn't have to make a ton of concessions around, you know, are we going to allow like RDP from the internet into our data centers or something? Which, by the way, that was like a 50% jump the first week of work from home, is people opened up RDP from the internet from the numbers that were previously reported. And so I think if you're going down the zero trust path, you're probably minimally impacted by this, maybe from a capacity perspective and being able to support that. But that's really the only impact that we've seen.
Yeah, I would add to that, as I indicated before, we chose that full cloud strategy route when we did all these changes. I got lucky, to be honest with you, and no bones about saying that. We had 60% of our workforce remote prior to COVID-19. We're now at over 95% remote. There are some people that have to go to the office for a variety of reasons. There's just no way out of it. But outside of that, BeyondTrust makes a remote access tool. And we were able to take our own tools and extend it to that change in the workforce to go remotely. So we were able to embrace the cloud-based directory store that we use, provide that remote access, and literally the effort and changes were minimal. We were able to just import more logs, bring more data in. Yes, there's a cost with that, but hey, it's health and the safety of our employees. So it wasn't a painful shift. Being embraced in the cloud, the directory and identities there made it very easy to do this.
Great, thank
Yeah,
you.
we were lucky. I think that we were sort of on that path as well, but being engineer heavy, they all wanted laptops. So, I mean, if you're listening and you guys have desktops and lots of on-prem architecture, you know, I'm sure you're hurting, but this can, I think, is a good opportunity to sort of make that argument for, we want to do zero-touch provisioning. We want to be able to, like, in the old model, we would have to get the device in our corporate environment. The IT people would have to sit down and put hands on it. We don't have to do that anymore, so we can support the remote workforce, right? And I've seen some folks who are in infrastructure-heavy organizations. They've gone and spun up, why can't I think of the name of the, dang it.
Cloud
Like
service.
Citrix makes one. What's that?
Yeah,
Microsoft RDS.
well, like
Yeah, more or less. VDI, there you go. Yeah, they've gone and like AWS has a VDI like as a service platform, and they can go in and spin up desktops pretty quickly. And that's one way you can sort of get your remote employees that are on their own device or something. You can give them kind of a secure portal into your environment too.
Yeah, it's funny. So we were at Adobe. Our leadership, you know, has been fantastic throughout the whole shift, and it's very interesting for us because we were lucky that we had done the zero trust thing, you know, and we had a really good deployment before the COVID-19 kicked off, and with a really still a good robust VPN solution. So the reality for us is we built all these things with the knowledge that our workers travel, our workers may be remote, they may be in the office, they may be whatever. So when everything shifted, I'm in weekly calls to talk about the work from home situation and what's the biggest problem. So some of our biggest problems were supply chain of laptops to India, or people ordering stuff from CDW and them having a backlog of orders for webcams, or people asking whether they can take their desk home from their office. I mean, so you know when you're getting to silly questions like, can I take my desk home from the office to make my work from home better? That you're like, well, we must have clearly solved the problem of access and apps and services while being remote. The interesting thing for our Zen team, which is our Zero Trust team, was the number of application requests that started coming out of the woodwork that people had to be, that they'd normally use VPN to get to. All of a sudden, we were onboarding via our Zen proxy like 30 applications a week. So it's been really fantastic for us because everyone's like, holy crap, these guys just saved the world, right? And everyone's walking around with like big grins on their faces because how clever were we? But the reality was now what we've done is we're in this limelight where we are busier than we've ever been because we are onboarding more apps. And then Adobe, there's so many things are self-service. We make it self-serving that you can SSO an app as you build an app without even talking to us. We have the portal for that. You can go do it. And that means we've got thousands and thousands of people that build apps and they use SAML and they use our self-service, but they're not all available via the internet. So now that process has really got busy over the last 40 days. I mean, it's incredible. And we saw about 10,000 users a day normally coming in via our Zen platform from remote without VPNing in. And now we're about 30,000 users. So that overnight just doubled and then went up again. And it's been a wild ride, but we were just glad we were there ready before it even started.
Thanks, Dan. So we've got a question from the audience, and it's something actually that I've kind of joke about that I think some organizations are going to be further down the path on cloud adoption and digital transformation and zero trust after COVID-19 because of COVID-19. But a question that we had from the audience is, what's your advice for companies that were not prepared for this work from home requirement? Should they be actively pursuing transformation and meeting the demands of the current landscape, or should we be continuing to push status quo until they have more time and energy to focus on the future? And before I turn it over to you guys, I mean, I actually think that we're going to see more companies really adopt work from home more regularly now, where I think some organizations, I mean, again, it could just be trust of the security, but I think it was also just physically seeing that employees can be productive when they're not in the office. And so I think we're going to see organizations shift a little bit back to work from home regularly, but I'm just interested on your guys' thoughts on that.
Sure, I'll take a first stab. I'd have to say for anybody that's looking at this problem, it goes to this whole panel discussion first. If you don't have a good identity model and a good relationship of identity to accounts, making people work from home gets really messy really fast, because really the only option is VPN to extend their persona, their system, to tunnel into the environment as if they were present, and then having to cross network zones or anything else that may be appropriate. If you focus on identity, or you have a decent identity account relationship model already, however you're doing it, whatever remote access technology you choose, whether that is the Bastion host, a dedicated tool, or whatever, it's really not that hard to spin people up remotely. But it goes down to the foundation of identity management first, and just my opinion.
Yeah, and I think the term "what's the new normal" is more important, because the reality is after this, and I don't know when this will be over, and I don't really know what this is, because the reality is that this is, yes, there's a nasty virus, and that's really, really bad news. But the business context of what this is, the work from home, what normal looks like, I think when people start to be allowed out again and allowed out to play, how that's phased in across the globe is going to be different across different countries. And that means that this new normal, I think, is going to continue for probably over a year. So it might not be that we're all working from home, but it might be in some countries your workforce is working from home because they're not allowed back. In other countries, certain workers might be allowed back. Different businesses will be different. Healthcare might be different than manufacturing of cars. I mean, so the reality is organizations and executives will need to realize that this is the new normal just now. And all these companies for years have said, enable your workers to work anywhere, anytime, any device. That's now. I mean, that needs to continue for the rest of time. And that's the biggest shift. If you've not had that mindset, well, now is the time for that mindset. And there's no point in procrastinating over status quo, or will we someday pick this up when we have time, because you'll never have time.
And I think, Dan, the one thing, I think you've summarized it pretty well. The one thing I would add is, the question related to, should we basically pursue a lot of the components of this whole, new normal, or should we maintain status quo? And I think, in the short term, if you weren't ready for this, you are in a constant pursuit right now, because more than likely, even if you got operational capability back with this new normal and remote workforce, you probably made concessions in security and things like that. And so you may have lost security visibility. You lost now, certain visibility that you're traditionally are used to having. And so you, if you're a security practitioner, you should be constantly in this pursuit phase until you get to a point to where you can get that all that capability back.
That's a good point, James. And one thing that I think too, so you have a healthcare background, you worked in healthcare. So I think of healthcare and financial services, and I think if organizations weren't ready, they've had to do whatever they can to provision access. And so they probably cut corners. And I've been there where I've had business leaders we just had to get things working. And I think that, if you're in that mode, firefighting in that way, I think that pursuit on how do we make this better to get the controls operating back in the environment, I think it's going to be really critical for many of those organizations.
The attackers know we've cut corners too, and so they know which corners that we've cut.
And my fear is that typically, if we cut corners and those controls, we probably don't have visibility into even what the attackers are doing at this point either. So.
And I noticed, Julie, that Bala's asked about the architecture, right? I think IDSA has published information on this topic. I know that most of the vendors on the call, or the partner vendors with IDSA, also have architectures published. And then we in Adobe, we published our white paper as well. So I think the good news is everything that we're discussing here, there's a lot of information that we've all collectively put together for the community to leverage.
Yeah, a lot of great material around that, especially around allowing these remote workers to have access to sensitive systems. I mean, you have people now working from home that were handling financials and contracts and things like that you would never have considered leaving your on-premise offices before. So to Den's point, most of us have created controls or expanded our own security controls to make sure that does not become a liability as someone's now working from home.
I think just to add to that question, I think our primary of whether to push, right, or for something new or kind of keep things the way they are. I think one of our main jobs as security leaders is to win hearts and minds, and I think a lot of us have sort of collected a lot of capital right now in this moment, sort of like political capital, maybe some goodwill, right, and just be careful how you spend that. So if you go and push for kind of like, I'm not going to let this crisis go to waste. I'm going to push and roll out some new stuff. If you cause an outage or bring the business down as you're trying to do that, you know, remotely, you could end up using up all that capital, right? So it might not be a bad time to just kind of sit back in a very non-judgmental way and accept that, like, oh, you did, you know, you were right. You told us this was going to happen, or whatever your case might be, and just keep things running. And then when things kind of return to normal, then sort of build on that and say, hey, you know, this is something that could, they're saying it might come back in the fall, right? Let's start pushing to fix this stuff when you can do it in sort of a stable way.
So real quick, I'm going to turn to, thank you, Clint. I know that Bala had some questions and Srini's got one as well around how the new identity architecture influences the new normal post-COVID era and access provisioning systems of retail and banking industry. One thing we did talk about is that some different white papers, I would say control frameworks, things that have been published by the Identity-Defined Security Alliance. There's a framework focused on security outcomes and vendor neutral approaches, which I would say answers most of those things that we've just talked about there. But a few examples are around privileged access requiring MFA, device characteristics used for authentication. And again, we talked about that a bit. Expected user behavior being used for authentication as well. And I'm just going to ask the panelists, can you talk about whether these are security outcomes you have achieved, how you've implemented suggestions or how to implement? And then again, these frameworks, they are posted on the IDS site. And so that's something too, that this information is out there for anyone on the webinar, anyone that wants to access it. So I don't know, I know that we've talked a lot about device characteristics and device management. Maybe if anybody wants to give any examples of how they're using user behavior for authentication.
So I can jump in for a second. We built a security intelligence team that really looks at the authentication behavior, looking for anomalous events. And we're just taking logs from Optiv, and it's really easy. You know, if you've got API access to pull logs and put that into Splunk or however you want to do it. Most of these authentication providers provide the same sort of capabilities to basically get logs, look at the logs, and you're looking at OS type, you're looking at location, you're looking at time, you're looking at the applications they access and all these patterns. Surprisingly enough, humans will click a button just because the button appears on their device. And we were finding that sometimes, you know, the bad actor might have you scraped a reused password from some dark site somewhere. So they've got the passwords that users often reuse. So we promote the use of password managers to make sure you don't reuse passwords. And then ultimately the second factor, you know, you're hoping that that's going to save you as well. And sadly, some humans, they'll push a button even though it's not them that try to initiate the login. So I think the good news is that's very rare and we're logging to catch it. But user behavior analysis and using machine learning and all those technologies, and a lot of vendors supply this stuff, and it's really, really useful. I mean, we have prevented a lot of incidents just because of that. So
maybe I'll add in. Dan, I'll forgive you for using the curse word in my world of Splunk, coming from LogRhythm with our own SIM and UEBA products. But, you know, I think when I look at behavior-based kind of authentication, you know, we touched on some of the IAM components, we touched on some of the other pieces, but even when you implement zero trust or you've had to do any type of GDPR work before, where you're looking at the entire workflows and roles and users and who's accessing what and how they're accessing it, you've got a pretty good baseline of what the behavior should look like already. And then being able to identify things that deviate from that baseline, or if the activity is strange, according, you know, off of, you know, significantly off from that baseline, being able to add in other controls, like step up controls and things like that, where you can validate like, okay, this person is deviating from the norm. But is it valid or not? And let's force them to like kind of sort of like re-authenticating, but step up some of the controls, put them in certain groups and classes and things like that. But that's how you can really use authentication data and behavior data to be able to interject into this model.
So just a quick question on that. Can you talk about the normal from a user standpoint? And I'm a big believer the more you can automate on these controls from user behavior and just that machine learning, I think we're going to be more effective. But with our new normal right now being drastically different, have you guys seen any big changes in that? I mean, I think not only location, but I think also like when people are working, just because they're managing life. Are you seeing any changes in the normal?
Yeah,
Yeah, significantly. We're not a big organization from an employee standpoint. We're only about 900 employees. And we do rely on an MSP for our security. They've taken the best practices from a lot of the user behavior that they're seeing across all of their organizations and help us. So many organizations don't have the expertise or the finances to go buy a tool or bolt something on or learn it. So from a behavioral standpoint, if there are MSPs or partners or anybody else that you could leverage, or even things that are built into your own tools, I would strongly encourage it because, Julie, right to your question, we are seeing people working in the middle of the night. We see people trying to use a personal VPN and appearing somewhere else in the world when they shouldn't be. They left it on from something they may have been doing earlier. Those types of behaviors, yes, they're false positives, but they're really important to make sure they're false positives, especially with everyone being remotely, and having that assistance via a good MSP has made that possible.
So I wanted to kind of close down that part of the conversation and really get your guys' take on, I mean, many of you have many, many years of experience in identity management and also just security management, but interested on, what is the most important identity and access management best practice or just foundational element that organizations should implement?
So Morey said it earlier on, let's get your identities in check. I mean, if you do not have a good foundation of going from your HR system and your identity management platform and then out to your directories or apps, then everything else is harder from there.
I would say identities of employees, contractors, like that whole third party, because I think even right now we're seeing a lot of third parties that organizations rely on. Their normal has changed as well. So I would agree with that, Den. Anybody else have anything to add?
I would just add one piece fundamentally that we shifted. I agree, identity account relationship. In my organization, security does not own identity. It's IT and HR. I'm just the consumer of the output. And that's a fundamental shift for many companies.
And are you able to influence, I guess, their governance around those identities?
I am. So we do, we are pursuing an ISO audit. So this has been one way to help with the segregation of duties, because we can tell something to HR, they'll use it, but ultimately as the consumer of the security information, I don't have a conflict of interest by managing it at the same time.
I have one last question for you guys. You touched on it a bit, talking about even owners of identity or outside security. But if you guys could give one piece of advice on how to better align identity, security, plus security, I would say plus the business in your organization, what would it be?
I think that's
I would, I would try and message it as a increasing velocity or lowering the user friction in the organization. So there's a lot of tools that you'll need to bring to bear, like single sign-on, which make people's lives easier. So wherever you can find those types of things to talk about, because, especially at the executive level, sometimes you run into folks who are less technically adept, and having pushes on their phone or some other device can be a little bit scary. So, talk about how you're going to make their lives easier in other ways.
I think the other pieces I'd add is for advice is the fact that, it's interesting. Identity just isn't IT and security and things like that. Literally every department, every organization within your company, everything that you operate has a function of identity that is needed there. And so I think if you can understand that across the board and where everybody kind of comes together in this one thing called identity, it's critical. And also you'll be able to understand the efficiency gains, the the use of identity, just tons of stuff that makes everybody's life easier in your business. And so being able to understand what that common ground is across the board around identity, I think it's critical to your success. And
one thing I'd add, James, I agree, is I think that with consumerization of IT and every business morphing and engaging their customers digitally, I think from a business standpoint, they can relate to their consumer, their identity, and how they're running with their customers. So I've used that as a way to engage the business, not just from an identity of the employee, but also the customers, because I think that that's something they can relate to on the protection components too. So anything else you guys would like to share? I know we are at the top of the hour. It's 1 o'clock and it's been a great discussion. We got through most of the questions. I want to welcome you guys to looking at and viewing just the IDSA website. And I'll turn it over to Julie Smith to wrap us up.
Thanks, Julie. Dan, James, Morey, and Clint, that was awesome discussion. I appreciate your time today and contribution to the IDSA. Before we sign off, I just want to share with you a few upcoming webinars that I'll hope you have an opportunity to attend over the next month or so. Thanks again for joining us today. As I mentioned, you'll receive a link to the webinar recording that you can share with your colleagues. We hope this time was well spent listening in on this discussion. And make sure to follow us on LinkedIn to get the latest blogs and news, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.